All right. We can't wait any longer. Maybe you won't be able to hear it. But life can surely be ironic. Because yesterday, I had the naive thought that because the weather had turned cold, I wasn't going to have to contend with the usual lawnmower sounds coming in on a Sunday afternoon into the attic. That nobody's going to be out there mowing their lawns when it's this cold, so I didn't have to try to get it done earlier in the day. I could have a leisurely morning and come here in the afternoon and do the recording more at my leisure. But you know what's worse than the sound of lawnmowers? The sound of leaf blowers. I've been sitting here for over an hour waiting for there to be some break in the sound of the leaf blowers, and there has yet to be one. Maybe you won't even hear it. Maybe it's just me. But here we are. This is Jay Brown Yoga Talks podcast. My name is Jay Brown, and I really appreciate that you are listening. And the truth is that if the least of my worries today is the sound of leaf blowers finding their way into the background of this intro, then you know I'm doing okay. And I'm happy to report that I am. If you were here last week, I let myself be a bit vulnerable and I shared some things. And when I do that here on the show, as I have done since I started the show more than 8 years ago, sometimes there's really a direct repercussion that the act of doing that for myself often seems to reverberate in a certain way. And sometimes when I reach out and I call out in that way, I get a response. And that definitely happened this week. There was several moments, 2 or 3 very specific moments where I felt that I was shown grace. And it was like this clear communication into my heart that I was okay. And one of those expressions of grace came in a gesture made by a listener of this show. And I already sent you a note, I know, but I also know that you're going to be listening to this, and I feel like it wants to be on the show in the sound of my voice. Because somebody listening took it upon themselves to be generous and make a gesture. And I don't even know if it was because they listened last week or the previous week when I had actually reached out for some help, but for whatever reason, this person made a gesture this week, and it had an immediate and direct impact for me on just like this holiday time, and it really meant a lot. And it wasn't just the gesture, it was like the timing of it felt like a communication from something much bigger than me. Like a spirit of humanity and of love coming through this gesture. So, again, I know I already sent a note, but just to say again, it really meant a lot to me, and it had a direct impact, and I am deeply grateful. Thank you so much, Lindy. And I also, coming off of last week, have been reflecting a lot on some of the questions I was talking about with John Stirk. And if you haven't listened to that, I encourage you to go back into it. But I was thinking about it in less philosophical terms and more in like practicalities, and really just looking at, okay, well, what are the things that I'm doing that are enabling me to know what's going on with myself and be able to express it in a way that was responded to, you know, that there is something that I was doing that was very healing, and I'm trying to model that in what I'm doing as a teacher, even what I'm doing here on the show. And what part of that has to do with the breathing and moving exercises? Because I've been thinking a lot about the way that my practice of asana and pranayama has evolved. And what it's about now is very different than in the past. And I'm trying to reconcile that some. And when I try to talk about it with people, I will often try to frame it around the nervous system because people want some kind of anatomical anchor for it. And if I can get us off of strength and flexibility or muscles and bones and into this idea of our nerves and how things are feeling, sometimes that's helpful. And while I was thinking about this, I got an email from my guest today, Diana May. And she said that she had listened to the show some, and she wanted to know if I was interested in having a conversation about yoga for the nervous system. And it was exactly what I was thinking about in that moment. So I took her up on that invitation, and I'm glad I did. I felt like we connected on some important things, and I think a more practical understanding of how my practice is evolving, and it seems like Diana's evolving in similar ways. So I was very glad to connect with her on that, and I'm happy to be sharing it with you today. Real quick before we get to it, let me mention that if you want to connect with me in other ways outside of listening to this show, there's definitely opportunities for us to do that. I've got ongoing live classes online that you can take. I've got in-person stuff. I've got a weekly discussion group that you could get in on. I also have a deep learning teacher training program if you're looking to go a little bit deeper into stuff. And you can also get access to the full-length archives of the show and help be a supporter by a podcast premium subscription. All of the stuff can be found at jbrownyoga.com. Okay, I think that we will just leave it there. I got a few things that we could touch base on, but let's do that on the other side. For now, let's go ahead and get into it. Let's listen to this conversation that I had with Diana May. Hello?
Hello.
Hello, Diana. I'm Jay.
Hi, Jay. So nice to meet you.
Yes, you too. Very nice to meet you. I don't know if you've listened to the show much, but let me mention that I am already recording, and if it's okay, I'd like to consider us having just begun.
That sounds wonderful.
Okay, cool. Well, listen, I also want to just kind of start off with you, and then for anybody else who listens to this later, I'm curious about something, because honestly, the way that these conversations come about for the show, like the process I go through of deciding who to have on the show, it's a very intuitive process, and I don't always know why exactly I respond to one email and not another, honestly. And with you, originally, as I think I mentioned in my email back to you, that you reached out and said, "Hey, Jay, you want to have a conversation about yoga and the nervous system?" And, honestly, a lot of times these days, I'm kind of less interested at looking at practice through an anatomical lens in certain ways. Although we'll probably do that a little bit today, maybe. But I first responded to it because I was having a conversation with somebody, and we were talking about how we aren't using yoga poses for strength and flexibility anymore so much. I mean, not that that's not in there, but that's not the focus.
Yeah.
And we were saying, well, okay, if doing poses isn't about like targeting muscle groups and making them stronger or more flexible, then what is doing poses about? And one of my stock things to say is it's a nervous system thing.
Yeah.
And yeah. I've had people on the show to talk about polyvagal theory, and I've had people talk about different somatic movement modalities, and we can talk about today, like, why so many yoga teachers seem to have moved in that direction, as you and I have both, it seems. But I guess before we get into other stuff, I'm just kind of curious if there was any reason why you reached out to me when you did. Like, maybe it was just that you wanted to get on podcasts so people might learn about you and what you do. And I don't know, you heard about me, or I don't know. It could just be like I get a lot of emails, people just kind of want to getting themselves out there, and sometimes it hits and sometimes it doesn't with me. Or was there some other reason in terms of why now you reached out?
Yeah, I mean, that's such a great question. And I think, like so many things, there's so many different reasons. Part of it is, this big transition for me to becoming an online yoga teacher. This is a whole new world for me. I taught since the pandemic. I transitioned my business entirely online, and all the studios I used to teach at in person closed their doors. So here I am. I've always considered myself a yoga teacher that's an independent yoga teacher. But then when my studios closed and I officially didn't have a studio, I was like, oh, no, I'm not. I wasn't on my own before. I am now. And so learning how to navigate this online world it's been so expansive in some ways and such a disorienting process in another way. So I wanted to figure out how to reach more people in this online world. And I know people listen to podcasts, so I started listening and looking up different podcasts, and I really saw that you just like to have conversations with people. And I saw you had conversations with so many people, a lot that I know, and I was like, I'm going to reach out to Jay Brown and see if we can have a conversation.
Well, I'm glad you did. And what I would say is, getting ready to talk to you, it became very clear why I think we've been brought together. And it has to do with, I think, kind of, a progression I've seen in myself in terms of how I come to understand yoga practice and teach yoga practice. And I would say I've observed it to be true in a lot of other teachers, that you and I seem to be from generations of teachers, like after yoga already hit the mainstream in a sense that there's kind of an evolution or a change that's happened in the way that people are presenting yoga, I think, compared to, like, I had someone on the show this week who is in her 80s and kept using the phrase, I sat at the feet of the masters.
Yeah.
Which was like a phrase, that was commonly used when I first got into yoga in the early 90s. But I guess with you, it seems to me that you and I don't know, I listened to another podcast you did a few months ago, and I really connected with you on something, which was that, I grew up in Los Angeles, but it was in the suburbs, and my parents never went camping, and I never spent any time like in the forest. I spent some time at the beach, but fast forward many years later, I'm in Brooklyn, New York, and I'm teaching yoga, and I'm teaching about Gayatri mantra and how it's about the phases of the light and nature and the connection of that to our breath. And I'm saying all this stuff, and I'm kind of realizing, like, all I'm teaching about with yoga has to do with nature, and I've never really spent any time in nature.
We're intuitively knowing, and I think yoga teachers do this a lot. We're tapped in, whether we know it or not. People who are drawn to yoga, I think, are tapped into something very subtle and very true. And, we are nature. Human beings are nature, and we're good at tapping into, yoga is such a personal practice, and being self-aware and realizing these little tiny shifts in our energy. We can speak to that. And yeah, I love those mind-blowing moments where we see it in nature too. And I'm like, oh, how nature is responding. I see myself doing that. And then this greater understanding that, yes, I am nature, you are nature. We're all part of this incredible universe.
Also, where I was going with it is that you, as I understand, you moved from home in Michigan to Chicago, right?
Yes, I did.
And I moved to New York City, and then you decide to move to California to get to nature. I move away from New York to go to Pennsylvania, but what happened that made you move from Chicago to California? Was it about needing to be near nature, or was it other stuff?
Yeah, I think at that time it was quite a surprise because I really loved Chicago. I had an amazing practice there, an amazing career there, an amazing social circle there. But my sister lived out in the Bay Area, and there was just something that drew me out west. And I think, at that time, I kind of saw, well, one, I wanted to be closer by family. I had no intention of being closer to nature. That wasn't on the forefront of my mind. Although I think when I got there and became more immersed in nature and just living in a place where I had so much access, whether I wanted it or not, I really think that's what drew me out there. And I couldn't have named that when I was living in Chicago. But I can only name that after the fact in retrospect. If I had to say, I would say it was my sister lived out there. I had visited a few times. I thought it was really fun. I knew there was a great yoga community out there that I was eager to, get to know a little bit better. It was family and yoga. But
is that how you ended up kind of hooking up with Annie Carpenter?
No, I had met Annie many years prior. Well, actually, one of the visits that I went to in San Francisco when I visited my sister when she lived there, the Yoga Journal conference was there, and I remember I couldn't afford a ticket to the Yoga Journal conference at that time, but they had community classes. And so I went to the free community class, which was Annie Carpenter. And I just remember, I was young, and I remember this, small lady come out, and I was like, I had this very, naive young thought in me that was like, oh, what will she teach me? And I don't know where that came from. Then maybe I saw myself in her or something, but she blew me away. And she was so full of life, so full of energy. So I was hooked. And then she traveled to Chicago and taught some intensives there that I signed up for. And then I traveled to train with her more extensively. And when I moved to San Francisco, she was still living in LA at the time.
Right.
So, yeah.
I see. Well, I remember when she came on the show back in, I think it was 2019. Beginning of 2019, I talked with her about teacher training, and she was like swearing off doing 200-hour trainings as was I. But she seemed like she touched a lot of different teachers' lives. Was your yoga practice like of a more, like what was your yoga practice like when it started?
Yeah, well, I started yoga when I was about 19 years old. And at that point in my life, I was very disconnected from my body. I was very much a brainiac and academic. I didn't have sports or any sort of like the typical thing that a young person might have to get them connected with their body. I was not connected. And then I started with an Ashtanga yoga class, which my sister said I should go to because she had heard that yoga helps with stress. And so I took this class and it was very taxing on my body. I couldn't do most of it, but I realized for the first time what my body was and that I had one and that I knew nothing about it. So I started with Ashtanga yoga, and then I loved in Detroit, there's a lot of power vinyasa and a lot of flowy type yoga.
Was that what Brian Kest was? No.
Yeah. Johnny Kest.
Johnny Kest, yes.
So Brian's brother, yeah.
Yeah.
So a lot of people are sort of in that world here. And so I loved that freedom at that time. I was young, and I loved the freedom that flow yoga gave me at that time. And I also think while it empowered me in a lot of ways, it also, I was still disconnected from my body as I was practicing, and I pushed myself way too hard, and I almost needed an extreme amount of physical exertion to feel certain things. As I've matured in both age and in practice, I've learned to really appreciate the more subtle So Annie Carpenter was one of the first people who was like, oh, you're really bendy here and not here, and pointed out some things to me that I didn't realize. So I got really into Anusara yoga and alignment yoga. And now it's just sort of morphed into more, I still love a strong practice, but I really like to balance it with softness as well.
Well, it's so interesting what you're saying about kind of not really being able to feel stuff, or even I had the idea in mind that like pain was opening, which someone had, I don't know, had in my mind, like what I was feeling was pain, but I thought it was just my body opening.
Right.
And how certainly there was approaches to practice, and you're being very diplomatic, because again, not everybody, I know why you're being diplomatic, because not everybody responds to flow practice or like strong vinyasa or whatever we're calling it nowadays in the same way. But it's certainly, for myself, it enabled and reinforced patterns in me that were not healthy patterns.
Yeah. I mean, I think it can, I think there's a lot of factors that can go along with it. And, occasionally I'll do a flow class, and an intelligently sequenced flow class can still feel great in my body. I'm a lot more sensitive now. I have so much more awareness of my body. So things that I maybe wasn't able to feel when I was 19 and newer and had less body awareness, but also was younger. It's just a lot different now. I'm like, oh, I feel things when things turn too quickly or don't make sense or this or that.
Would say, I would also kind of go back to where we started, in a sense that it's also not just about like how intelligently, from like a technical standpoint, it's sequenced. It's like why we're doing certain things with our body, like what's the ideas behind it in a way. So I guess from your own experience of practice, what's different in a practice that's not about kind of getting your heart rate up or trying to have a particular alignment? If it's not about those things, what is it about for you these days?
I mean, to me, in the most simple way, it's to be present with my body as it is in this moment.
Fair enough.
Yeah. And sometimes I do still need vigor to get there. I wish I could be evolved enough to not need strong asana at times to feel connected to my body. I'm not there yet. Some days, I do give myself a lot more freedom to listen. And because I've done that more consistently, I get more messages from my body. I'm able to discern what I need in that moment. But yoga is really about awakening us to who we are in the moment. And so often I can be clouded, or people can be clouded, and we don't see all of ourselves. And that's part of human nature. So I think for me, yoga is about seeing more fully where I am in the moment.
Right. And where you are in the moment might not necessarily be always like calm or perfect or blissful or something.
Correct. Yeah.
So it's not like a state that you're trying to accomplish, but practice is a kind of way of gaining some facility or like awareness around stuff.
Yeah. And that just segues so perfectly into the nervous system work, because so often I think the people misconstrue a goal of yoga is to be even keeled all the time, or calm all the time, or in a state of peace or bliss all the time. And that's really not quite accurate. Our nervous system is meant to be dynamic. It's, a regulated nervous system has capacity to be present with the full range of human emotion.
Wait, can we say that again? A regulated nervous system has capacity. What was the rest of it?
Has capacity to be with the full range of human emotion and human experience.
Boom. And the full range includes a whole bunch of stuff that you may not really enjoy.
Exactly. So you can be angry and regulated at the same time. You can be sad and regulated at the same time. You can be happy and calm and regulated at the same time. So regulated doesn't mean a flatline experience of like, I am good all the time. And in fact, if you find yourself very even keeled, like everything's fine, I'm calm no matter what.
You're probably full of it.
Yes. Yeah. Yeah. Off. And we see that, and that's actually a very intelligent nervous system response to protect you from being overwhelmed. And
right.
So your capacity might not be big enough for that experience you're having.
Now, what's interesting to me about what we're talking about is because that idea makes sense. Yes. Okay. So I'm not trying to necessarily control my emotions or not have my emotions. I just want to have awareness around my emotions so that I can make kind of choices around my behavior or be healthy in processing everything, right?
Yes.
Now that idea, like you and me, seem to be very intellectual or analytical about being able to articulate that. But the reality of being able to kind of feel that or kind of be in that, it's not like a thinking process of so much as a feeling process. And that's why I think all the yoga teachers have gotten into somatics.
Yeah, I agree with you actually. And I want to see even more of it. I think it's such a brilliant thing. And yoga by nature is a somatic practice. So I think there's actually a lot of confusion.
Yes. Like when people say somatic yoga, what does that even really mean? Right.
Right. And because yoga works with the body, and the body is, soma means body. So yes, all yoga is inherently a somatic practice, but learning to discern where we have a more constricted response, where we're maybe too open, and like finding practices that can bring us back into a center, which doesn't mean flatlined.
Right.
Yeah.
Well, I think a lot of times when people are saying somatic yoga, it means that they are drawing upon different influences that they're bringing into their yoga practice of different movement modalities. And I know you studied with, is it Maureen Gallagher? Or also you mentioned in another talk, Peter Levine. Is that some of the stuff that you've been drawing upon?
Yeah. I've studied, I'm in somatic experiencing training, which is a trauma. Somatic experiencing is based off of Dr. Peter Levine's work through regulating nervous system and sort of working with trauma in the body through the nervous system. And so the teacher that I'm studying under, her name is Dr. Maureen Gallagher, but it's largely based off of Dr. Peter Levine's work. She's just one of the facilitators of the training that I'm doing currently.
I see.
And she's amazing.
Well, what is it about that work that's maybe different than what you learned in your yoga training, or what is it that you're bringing to your yoga training from there that you feel is an important part of what you're teaching now?
Yeah, well, I think there's so many things that are different. In yoga, I'm really telling people what to do with their bodies. Of course, within a container of giving them as much agency as I can and creating a safe enough space where people feel empowered to have agency over their movements if they want to do more or less or this or that. Mm-hmm. But ultimately, in a yoga class, I'm telling you what to do.
To some degree or not, unless it's totally free form and people are just rolling around. But yes, generally speaking, you're still saying inhale, arms out and up, exhale, forward bend sometimes, right?
Yeah. Yeah. Or even, lay in this restorative pose and notice your breath. I'm telling you to notice your breath.
That's right. Yeah.
And there's
even if it's with invitational language, even if it's an invite, still on your suggestion, it's not just somebody deciding completely on their own.
Yeah. And I actually think having and creating a container to do that is so helpful for so many people so much of the time. So I really love this sort of container of a yoga class or a yoga workshop or a training to do that, because people need support and guidance. It's like, you can have a blank sheet of paper and say, write something on it. And we're like, wait, what? What do I write? Or you give people a journal prompt and they have a little bit more to say, or you give people an essay and you're like, make corrections. And you're like, I would have written this entire different way. So with structure comes creativity. And I fully experience that. I fully believe in that.
Right.
In somatic experiencing and in work with the nervous system, I would be listening. I'm getting trained in reading your more subtle cues. And there's an acronym called ROSE. So resonance, observations, self-report, and education. So that's ROSE. And so if I'm in a session with somebody for somatic experiencing, working with healing trauma in their nervous system, I'm in a more resonant field with them. And so what do I feel is happening between you and I? Because our bodies are neurocepting all the time. Neuroception is a term coined by Dr. Stephen Porges, where our whole autonomic nervous system is receiving millions of bits of information every second, and our system is assessing whether or not we're safe or whether we're under threat. So neuroception is happening all the time. My nervous system is going to be interacting with yours. Even over the internet, it happens.
Right now, yes.
Yeah. And so in that, as our nervous systems dialogue, there's a resonant field. And, what am I perceiving? What am I noticing in the resonant field? Is that you or is that me? Right? So like, do I think you're stressed or am I stressed and projecting it onto you? So like a little more training with differentiating what's in the resonant field and being like, actually, I think that person's stressed and it's not me. Or whatever, that's a simple example.
Right.
Observation. So noticing how that person is communicating, whether it's by simple, spontaneous facial expressions, by, spontaneous movements their body's taking, a hand twist, a nostril flare, looking away, looking toward. I think the statistic is something like 97% of communication is nonverbal. Right. So somebody could be saying a word like, I'm fine.
Yeah. And they're not fine at all. Yeah.
and we can tell. Yeah. Well, because the word is only 3% of what's being communicated. And then, of course, there's self-reporting. So if I'm not sure, just like, what's going on? What was that? Tell me what's in your awareness. And it's way less structured. So it's more up to them to report what's in their awareness versus me as a yoga teacher, like, move your arm and can you feel the external rotation in your shoulder and its connection to your rib case?
That's only one type of yoga class, but yes, your point is well made.
Yeah. I teach a lot like that, so that's why
I see. Yes, I get it. So that's the distinction you're making, because if that's the kind of inquiries you're having in your yoga practice, then the somatic experiencing work is going to be very different. I think a lot of people are making their yoga classes more like what you're doing in your somatic experiencing. It's not going to be the same as like a one-to-one situation.
Right.
But it seems like they're bringing a lot of those kind of elements in. So the last one is education. That's where you help people understand what's going on in their bodies more. Is that through just telling them about what's going on with their anatomy and stuff, or other kinds of stuff?
Any kind of somatic education. So one, for example, and this is a common one because a somatic technique or even a yogic technique is the orienting process. So I might just have people look around and look at their environment. And we do that in yoga too, and I do this in yoga classes.
Listen to the sounds that are coming into your ears right now, That's a orientation, right? Or even or inviting someone to orient to their breath would be orienting to something, right? Yeah. And so sometimes people don't get it and they're like, this is stupid.
Or like, why are we doing this? Or like, I don't feel anything, or do we have to do this? Or,
Yes.
And so in those moments, I can provide some education. Like, when you've experienced trauma, your full experience fragments. And so things are uncoupled from other things. And so orienting or looking around is one way to reconnect some dots, and I might not go into a full science explanation of that, but just sometimes easing those like, wait, why are we doing this? Nothing's happening. There's something wrong, or, whatever comes up for the person.
Yeah. And it's a very, kind of, I don't know what the word I'm looking for. I want to say tenuous or special moment, actually, in a way, now that I think about it, when you're offering someone a practice and they're like, I don't feel anything. I think back to myself and having a very particular moment where I was quite proficient in being able to execute a lot of different poses and could chant Sanskrit mantras and had all this whatever quote unquote knowledge. But then a teacher asked me, how do you feel? And I had no idea and couldn't answer that at all.
Right.
And kind of realizing like, I actually am practicing in a way that is not bringing me into feeling. It's actually helping me continue to avoid feeling, like we were kind of saying earlier.
Yeah.
And then that process of like recognizing that is sort of what the invitation is, right?
Yeah. Like, I'm aware that I don't feel anything. And that seems so silly, but before you were aware of it, you weren't aware of it.
No, exactly. I wasn't even thinking about it. Or even it was just on an autopilot kind of situation or something.
Yeah. Yeah, those are gems. Those moments are gems where you can like, holy crap, I am now aware that I'm disconnected from my body in this moment. Like, that's profound. That's a profound experience. Or
a lot of times I think it's happened for folks, and this is partly true for me, because it took me more than one time to get the lesson, I think, where you just have so much pain at a certain point.
Yeah.
Like the pain takes over and it puts you down. And you're like, oh my God, what happened? Super yogi can't walk.
Yeah.
And then you have to face it because your body is like, listen, you can't keep doing this.
Yeah, gosh, I could say so much about that, and everyone's experience is probably so different. But, I do think in a lot of, if you lump yoga in with the fitness world, which I think a lot of people do, there's that old internalized message of no pain, no gain. And if I'm not feeling my muscles contract, if I'm not feeling the stretch, then I must not be doing anything. Mm-hmm. And there's also a lot of societal accolades for getting the deepest back bend or the coolest arm balance. And I love that. I mean, I think that's awesome. And it's one small element, and most people are going to feel, that's too much for most people. You can train your body to do a lot of things, but for most people, the extreme nature of a lot of yoga postures are too much.
Well, if your purpose, as I said earlier, behind doing practices is to help someone develop a regulated nervous system.
Yeah.
We're not taking off the table that for some people, it might be that doing arm balances helps them develop a more regulated nervous system. But I would say the vast majority of people that I meet, that's not the case. That it's more of like everybody's so tweaked up that it's a down regulation. That's why my practice has become so much about that, because that's what I need in a way.
Yeah. Yeah. A lot of people are already overstimulated and could use from an overall level of lowering their level of activation. When people are activated or have too much activation in their system, it can present in lots of different ways, including dissociation from the body, where then, you don't even notice you're pushing yourself because you don't feel the pain.
Yeah. And also I think there's also kind of another, I think a misconception about how you utilize, how practice helps you deal with anxiety. And the idea is almost this idea like anxiety is like a lactic acid in your muscles that you can sweat out or something. And I found that like dealing with utilizing practice to help me deal with anxiety is a very different process than like going for a run and kind of getting out of my head. How do you think using practices, whether it's yoga or somatic experiencing, helps someone learn how to deal with anxiety?
Yeah, well, always the first thing I like to try to connect with is the value of our anxiety. And
the value of it. Okay. Let's love our anxiety first.
Yeah, and I know that seems silly, but finding some, like all of our anxiety or a chronic anxiety or it's our system responding to some kind of stress in the best way it knows how. And at some point in our history, our nervous system decided that us being hypervigilant and worrying about something is going to keep us safe. So when we're
good reason to have anxiety right now.
Yes, we do.
You'd be kind of crazy if you didn't have any anxiety right now.
Ironically, huh?
Yes.
Yeah. So I always like to start with just honoring the response our nervous system is having as being inherently intelligent, inherently protective, and just giving it a space at the table. And even, sometimes I'll tell my clients, it can be here as long as it needs. I think sometimes we're so resistant to our responses because our intellectual brain is like, we're too anxious. We need to fix our anxiety. I need to either run a bunch or do some meditation or get this anxiety out of here. It's not helpful. And that itself is a nervous system response that is also very helpful and has a purpose. But really,
it's also very self-perpetuating, right? It just keeps you in the anxiety place.
Yeah. And we can be defended against our nervous system responses. And so really giving space to see it as an intelligent response to the situation you're in can be really helpful for people and not be so defensive against the way our system is protecting us. So to me, and that's very yogic.
That's about like the relationship you're having with your body and what's happening in it and like not seeing it as like broken or like an enemy or something.
Yeah. Yeah, and even that can, ironically, lower your overall level of activation.
Right.
Which might help ease some of that anxiety. But very rarely when I'm upset and having an anxiety freak out, if somebody tells me to just calm down, it's going to get worse.
Yeah.
So, yeah, I always like to start with honoring where I'm at, seeing it as an intelligent response, even if it's not comfortable. And then from there, really asking my body what it needs. My brain might say, oh, you need to run, or oh, you need to meditate. But I'm not concerned with what my brain thinks. I want to be able to create a relationship with my body. Do I have any impulse to move in a certain way? If so, how? And that kind of thing. So that's how I do it. And then maybe you do, it's like, oh, I really need to collapse right now. Maybe a restorative practice is a nice way, a more positive way to induce a relaxation than say, distract myself by, binge watching TV or whatever I might want to do. Or maybe my body's like, oh, actually, like I feel a lot of energy in my legs. My legs want to move, so I could do some lunges. I could go on that walk. I could go on a run, like listening more to what my body's asking. How does my body want to move?
I know. I guess that's the interesting question. And I've heard people hear people saying that a lot, like listen to your body. What is your body telling you? And I guess that's what we're talking about is like being able to have some idea or not some idea, have an awareness because it's not an idea. It's a feeling. Right? The listening is a feeling. That's the thing, right? That the listening we're talking about when we say listen to what your body is telling you, it's you having awareness of what you're feeling or what's happening in your body on a feeling level, not like, oh, I'm listening and my body speaks to me in a voice and says, you need restorative today, you know?
Yeah. And, you know, the cool thing about the nervous system is that it pendulates. It is designed to go up and down. Our system wants us to recalibrate, and it will.
If you are hearing this message, then you're listening to the free version of J. Brown Yoga Talks. To hear the rest of our conversation, please subscribe to Podcast Premium at jbrownyoga.com/premium.